This is the second video dealing with informal logical fallacies. In this video, we'll look at the logical fallacies you see on your screen now. These are the fallacies that are especially interesting, relevant, and common, and we want to look out for them in our own speech, in the speech of others, as well as in writing, both political as well as philosophical. Let's begin to go through them. The first one listed at the top of the page is the hasty generalization. The example that I've provided is one that's unfortunately probably common, but it is a type of stereotype, as all hasty generalization fallacies involve jumping to conclusions inappropriately. They're the basis of all stereotyping, all prejudice, all racism and sexism, etc. So the example is, quote, "Man, Jenny is dumb. Therefore, all girls are dumb." You see why this is jumping to conclusions and why it's stereotyping. It's taking a single instance or a single example and thinking that it applies to an entire class of people or things. There are various other examples of stereotypes, prejudices, that are all equally unpleasant. But I'm going to list a number of them because they're common and because they're fallacious, meaning they're logical fallacies based on an inappropriate jumping to conclusions, or what's called in logic the hasty generalization fallacy. Unpleasant examples in our society are things like Mexicans are lazy. That's a hasty generalization. Whether or not any individual Mexican is or is not lazy does not mean that the entire class of people who are Mexican are therefore lazy. That's a hasty generalization. It's the basis of stereotyping. It's a prejudice, a type of racism. And understanding logic helps us understand why it's wrong, why it's bad thinking, in addition to morally inappropriate. Another example is the claim that because one Asian person is smart or a bad driver, therefore all Asian people must be smart, hardworking, or bad drivers. These are hasty generalizations. They're stereotyping and a form of a logical fallacy. The idea that women are emotional, or especially emotional, or more emotional than men, is a hasty generalization. Whether or not any one particular woman is or is not especially emotional gives us no reason to infer that therefore all women, all members of that class, are especially emotional. That would still be a hasty generalization. It's a stereotype and a form of sexism. Other unpleasant examples would include the idea that black people are criminals or thugs. This one is, again, unfortunately, rather well known in our society. an issue we will try and deal with from time to time as we can throughout our discussion of the history of ideas. But whether or not any one particular or any group of black people have or have not committed crimes does not tell us anything or allows us to make no logical inference about the whole class of black people and criminality. That's stereotyping. It's a logical fallacy, and it's the basis of racism. It's bad thinking in addition to being immoral. We could equally as well give the example that all men are rapists, or that all men are pigs or violent. Those would similarly be forms of a hasty generalization, a form of stereotyping or prejudice, regardless of the actions of any one individual man. That does not allow us to make a logical inference about the entire class of men. These are stereotypes. They're logically fallacious ways of thinking. Let's go on to the next one. And this will remain controversial. This one is called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. It means, translated from Latin, after this, therefore, because of this. And in the most simple sense, this is the basis of all superstition. It happens when a mere temporal coincidence, or two things happening close to each other in time, is assumed to have a cause and effect relationship. I've given the example of, I did a rain dance, then it rained. Therefore, it must have rained because I did a rain dance. While those of us who are not of a Native American heritage might think that that's silly even, or superstitious, maybe quaint, and therefore be dismissive of it, there are examples from the broader dominant culture that also have this form of the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. One example would be a few years ago when the governor of the state of Texas, Rick Perry, suggested that to deal with an especially bad drought in the state of Texas, that people should pray for rain. And what happened is that eventually it did rain. And so people would be tempted to think it rained because of my prayer. However, that would be an example of a post hoc ergo propter hoc logical fallacy. This becomes especially important when we're dealing with issues of what's called faith healing, where people, for example, have a cold and they pray to be better and their cold passes. They might think, my cold passed because of my prayers. My cold went away because of my former action. That has the form of a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Now, to say that prayer is logically fallacious or superstitious is definitely stepping on toes. Nor am I suggesting that all prayer is logically fallacious or superstitious. As we look later through the semester, what we'll find is that prayer and contemplative meditation is ubiquitous or universal. It's practiced in practically every single culture around the globe throughout all of history. There are other interesting issues, too, about what the purpose of prayer is, both theologically as well as philosophically. Is the purpose of prayer to have wishes granted? Or is the purpose of prayer to align oneself with God's desires and will? That level of philosophical discussion or theological discussion, to use our previous vocabulary, metaphysical discussion, isn't the point now. However, when from time to time there are people who, instead of going to a doctor to treat sick children, merely attempt to use prayer, these issues do actually become life or death. And so the application of logic, ethics, and politics at that point becomes relevant. The post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy would also be seen when a gambler has a lucky talisman or a lucky rabbit's foot. Perhaps in at least some cases of using homeopathic medicine or being anti-vaccine, as in the example, I did not give my child vaccines, and then he did not become autistic. Therefore, he did not become autistic because he did not receive vaccines. That, without a rigorous, scientific, peer-reviewed methodology, would very likely be fallacious. Let's go on now to the slippery slope fallacy. My favorite example is the children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. If you remember the story, it goes that if you give a mouse a cookie, he'll ask for a glass of milk. If you give him a glass of milk, he'll ask for a napkin. If you give him a napkin, he'll want to take a nap on your couch. And long story short, if you let him take a nap on your couch, he'll never leave and you'll have a mouse in your house forever. That's a slippery slope. It's a sort of snowball effect or domino effect, where one bad effect leads to a worse one, and so on, and so on, and so on. While that example is silly and childish, a relevant political example is absolutely life and death. Part of the argument that helped to spur the American public into war in Vietnam very likely had the form of a slippery slope logical fallacy. The argument was called the domino theory of communism. It went that if we allow Vietnam to fall to communism, next it will be Laos, then Cambodia, then the whole world will be stuck in a communist nightmare. Now, when you have a possible or potential logical fallacy, what you have to do is determine, has a logical fallacy been committed? This actually opens up room for more discussion rather than shutting it down. Merely pointing out a logical fallacy does not win an argument or in the debate. Instead, it opens up room for more discussion as to whether or not the slippery slope is indeed likely to occur. The same would be the case with regards to the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy that we just discussed, or even the hasty generalization, or any of these that we've went through. Other forms of the slippery slope fallacy would involve things like, if gay marriage is legalized, that will lead down a slippery slope to bestiality. Or, so long as abortion remains legal, that will lead to the crumbling of our institutions, the crumbling of marriages, the crumbling of society, of civilization, or simply an apocalypse. Those appear to have the form of the slippery slope logical fallacy. However, as in all cases of apparent fallacies, the burden is on the arguers to determine if a fallacy really has been committed. The final two informal fallacies I'll discuss in this video are the false dichotomy and the circular argument. The false dichotomy happens when an arguer is given only one of two options to choose between, when more options than those presented may be applicable. For example, in former President Bush, the second President Bush, his famous dictum, either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. That has the form of the false dichotomy logical fallacy. What you can say when presented with a false dichotomy is perhaps there's a third option that may be available. For example, in this case, you could say, I don't like you, and I don't like the terrorists. I'm on neither of your sides. While that's not likely to win you an especially large amount of friends, it is a way out of the false dichotomy. You will likely notice that this rhetorical device suffices to create an in-group, out-group division, or creates social cohesion, which is especially important politically in a time of war. The last of the informal fallacies that we'll discuss is the circular argument. I've given two examples here, and you can evaluate them to try and understand why these qualify as circular arguments, or why they could be referred to as committing the begging the question fallacy. The circular argument is also called begging the question because a key premise or part of the argument is missing, often because it's controversial, which makes the logic circular and therefore fallacious. The first example is, the Bible is the literal, revealed Word of God because it says so in the Bible. This example is missing the key premise, which is controversial, that the Bible is true and accurate. And obviously, people would disagree on that claim. A Muslim would likely disagree that the New Testament is accurate or accurately interpreted, in the same way that a Christian would disagree that the Quran would be divinely inspired. if we change up the argument that the Quran is the literal revealed word of God because it says so in the Quran, while the Christian might think that that's good logic or bad logic, it would still have the form of a logical fallacy. A circular argument, or begging the question, logical fallacy. The second example, that abortion is morally wrong because murder is wrong, is missing the key premise that abortion is murder, which is controversial and people would disagree on it. It begs the question, how do you know that abortion is murder? Or what is your reason for claiming that abortion is murder? In the first example, the question that's being begged is, how do you know the Bible is true and accurate? Or, what is your reason for believing that the Bible is true and accurate? In the second example, abortion is morally wrong because murder is wrong. Leaving out that key premise allows it to sound like the logic is sound and valid. However, a perceptive logician can clearly label this as a circular argument or committing the begging the question fallacy, because it doesn't answer why the people discussing the issue should agree that abortion is murder. Now, that question of whether or not abortion is murder, while it might seem simple to answer just, yes, it is, or I feel like it is, or I think it is, or my religion says that it is, what we'll see as we go on through the semester, in the first case, is that for some religions, killing cows to eat them is as immoral as murder. But if we were to use the same argument or the same logic to suggest that hamburgers are morally wrong because murder is wrong, likely not everyone would see that issue the same way. And so we'll discuss not only the relevance of these fallacies to the history of philosophy throughout this semester, but especially at the end of the semester, we'll spend some time focusing on the ethics and politics of abortion in the context of the philosophy of technology, as well as feminism and feminist critiques, which are an important, new, and probably radical form of philosophical inquiry. But more on that later. You're certainly welcome to skip to that lecture if you're interested. However, I will encourage you not to overlook the stuff that comes in between, because the question of abortion is a new question, and the history of ethics and politics relating to human reproduction is ancient. So, we'll be playing around with those ideas very soon.